It's more than a day's walk. So we know he had traveled and stopped along with that. But when he got there, there was an incident that Mark wanted us to be aware of. And in fact, let's take a look over at Matthew and look a little bit at the account of this in Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 to 31. Matthew 15, 29 to 31. And here Matthew is recording this same incident, this same happening, and he has a little different perspective, and it's always good for us to look at those things in a different perspective. And here Matthew records for us, Jesus departed from there, and that there being Tyre and Sidon region, and went up on a mountain and sat down there. So he's saying they had traveled that way, and Jesus didn't go into the city. He went up on a mountain and he sat down there. And what happened? He was thronged. It isn't a surprise to him or to us. It says verse 30, then a great multitude came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the mute, the maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. Jesus went up and sat on the side of this mountain, and they came to him. They were bringing those who had all sorts of different ailments, different challenges, and why'd they lay him at Jesus' feet? They had heard about him. Now remember, at this time, Jesus had been back and forth across the Sea of Galilee a number of times in the boat with his apostles and disciples. And he'd do some teaching and preaching in one area and some healing. And then he'd go to the other side of Galilee, and then he'd do the same thing there. They'd throng him, and he'd go back to the other side. So they knew of the work that Jesus did. So in Mark, it talks about one specific person and one specific incident. But here in Matthew, it talks about they had all these people, that great multitude that came to him, as it tells us in verse 30, having with them, they brought all these who were needed healing, they brought them to Jesus. We're not going to take a chance that he's going to come down our street in the village. We're not going to take a chance that he may go on and not come near us. They brought those needing Jesus' healing with them and laid them at Jesus' feet. And they had all these different ailments. Verse 31 in Matthew chapter 15 says, so the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. They glorified the God of Israel. So as they're going through and bringing those to Jesus, they're expecting them to be healed. They're desiring, they're wanting that. That's why they brought them there. That's why the crowd is coming to him. And as we've talked about it before, the miracles weren't the main purpose that Jesus came to this earth. It wasn't the healings that brought Jesus down to this earth and to the Jews. The miracles were there to confirm who he was and the power he held. The reason he was there was bringing that message that his Father had given to him, that he come down and he share the message of redemption from sins. Manny? Yes. He came down to save us. Now, if we were back in that time, but who we are today, he wouldn't have been coming down to us. We're Gentiles. You know, Jesus came to the Jews. And that's what he told the woman who found him in that house where he went to get away from everybody. And she wanted her daughter healed. We looked at that last week. And he said, I have only come to the lost of Israel. But she said, even those little dogs can get some crumbs that fall from the table. Even a Gentile, a non-Jew can benefit from your teaching. And her daughter was healed because of that. So as we look at this, Jesus is there and he is giving them that message. And certainly he is healing these people as they are brought to him. But his main purpose is to give them the message that his Father gave him to deliver. Through the blood of the Lamb, sins will be washed away. And that was his message to them. So, here he is on this mountain, and there are all these people who are coming to be healed from all these different problems. The blind, the deaf, the mute, those who have been maimed or hurt in an accident, those who were born with defects, those who needed other kinds of healing. But Mark chose this one incident and said they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. It was the case then, as it is often the case today, where those who are deaf or have a hearing deficiency, often their speech is not as clear as our speech. They do the best they can, but they can try to speak based upon what they can hear. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us as this person came. But what happened in verse 33 is a little unusual. It says he took him aside from the multitude. He didn't lay his hands on him and heal him. He didn't take care of it right there amongst the crowd. He took him aside and he did something that was a little unusual. Verse 33, he put his fingers in his ears and he spat on his hand and touched his tongue. If anybody has the answer to why he did that, I'd be obliged to hear it. I don't know. The scriptures don't share it with us, but there was something that happened there that may have meant more to them than it does to us today. But whatever that was, Jesus solved the problem. Jesus did what benefited this man. And it certainly benefited him physically. But spiritually and emotionally, there may have been something else that how he healed him, meant something to them. It gives us an example that Jesus took the time to know this man. Yes. That wasn't done. Yes, it could have been that emotional that went along with that if he had not had people touch him like that before. It was important. It was important enough that Mark makes it clear to us that this was different from the others. Yes. Boy, I don't know. We can speculate on why, and it could have been, because I can't say it wasn't, because I don't know really what happened. But we know that at the end of it, everyone knew what had happened. So it wasn't like he took them away and that multitude didn't know that Jesus had healed him. Maybe he wanted quiet, some quiet time. We'll see it in a couple places as we go through Mark, and it was shown to us before in the book. But in verse 34, we get an insight into Jesus' heart that he has seen so much pain in all these people, so much distress. It says, then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, be opened, when he was talking about his ears and his voice. Looking up to heaven, he was still looking to his Father. We might speculate or imagine, why he did that, but for me, in the last few days, you don't have to watch too much TV to really have your heart go out to people whose lives have been split wide open. People who have lost everything. People who are down there and they don't know which way to turn next. Jesus had to feel that every day as He's preaching and teaching and healing. Spiritually, those people needed His words more than His healing. But physically, He had to feel their deep distress because of those physical things that they were experiencing. You know, we understand that sometimes you can't get to the point of recognizing your spiritual needs until your physical needs are met. Manny? Yes, as we're going through trials and having things come into our life, we pray and know that God's presence is there, and knowing that and the strength that God is able to give us through His Son and through our faith, that lifts us up. And, you know, Jesus could have felt that same thing. We talked in previous classes about the fact that the Scriptures tell us that with each healing, power went out from Jesus. He felt that power go out from Himself, and it's most evident, I think, to us. It kind of jumps off the page at us as He was going through the crowd, and the woman touched the hem of His garment, and He didn't know where she was or who she was or able to recognize that, but He felt that power go out from Him in that healing. And I think like that, parallel to that, is what He feels when He is looking at all the suffering on this earth, and knowing that even that suffering, physical suffering, cannot compare to the fact that they are lost and separated from God. There were still faithful Jews, and sometimes we try to, put everybody in the same bucket and say, Israel was lost and nobody was faithful. And that wasn't true, because the Scriptures tell us that there was always a remnant who were faithful, there were still those who were looking for that Messiah. Now, their leaders had kind of led them in the wrong direction, so they hadn't told them what they should be looking for, because they were looking for an earthly king. But there were those who were looking. And as we understand that, we talked about it a few weeks ago. The three classes of people who followed Jesus as he was teaching, preaching, and ministering. The first part of that, the first class of people were those who were really looking for the Messiah. The second class was those who were hearing what's new in the world. You know, we've got someone here who'll give us a new teaching we haven't heard before, so we can come and listen to what this guy is going to tell us. And certainly that philosophy was focused around the Greeks and the Hellenistic Jews, those who were looking always for something new. The third class of people, that third group, were the Jewish leaders who were afraid of losing their position. And we're going to see them again as we get into chapter 8. So there are those, that multitude, who are looking for that message of Christ and the Messiah that he was bringing. And that's where the most of these multitudes came from. And when Jesus had taken this man away from the crowds and healed him, and he could hear and he could speak plainly. Now remember, maybe he took him away because he couldn't hear, and Jesus wanted him to focus on Jesus so he'd understand a little bit about what was going on. We don't know. That's still speculation. I have nothing to give you as far as definitive answers on this. But when he took them there and he healed them, in verse 36, now that he could hear and now that he could speak plainly, Jesus commanded them that they should tell no one, told him, don't tell anyone what I have done. We've kind of talked about the psychological effect of that. Yes? Yes. Yeah. So Jesus tells them, don't tell anyone what I did for you. And of course, even here it says, you know, something wonderful happens to you, and they say, don't tell anyone. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to tell somebody. But the more he commanded them, at the end of verse 36, the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. You know, Jesus knew psychology. You know, I tell them not to do something. Remember, we're like little children. You tell them not to do something, and they're going to have to see why we're going to tell. He was going to tell everyone he knew. You remember me? I lived in this house down the street. I couldn't hear and I couldn't speak plainly. No, can't be. Oh, yeah. The teacher came named Jesus, and he healed me, and now I can hear everything that happens. And I can speak plainly. Who isn't going to tell that story? And in verse 37, and they were astonished beyond measure. Boy, you know, that's the understatement, isn't it? They were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. Must be the Hebrew or Greek language doesn't have, words like amazing and an extraordinary and all the other terms that the young people, use to talk about something that is just beyond belief. He did all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Jesus did that well. Did you have a comment, Jeff? I think certainly it would have been the apostles and those disciples that traveled with Jesus. But then, if we look at the account back in Matthew, it says, as he went up and sat on the mountain, a multitude gathered around him. Let's go back and take a look at that. Matthew 15, verse 29. Verse 29 says, he went up on a mountain and sat down there, and then 30, then a great multitude came to him, having with them the lame, the mute. So there was a large group, and I don't imagine he took this one man far from him. But it's likely when he came back to the assembly of his disciples and apostles and that multitude that, Jesus took this deaf person away and he brought back the person who could speak. And remember, the they may be that same they it talks about in 32 of Mark chapter 7. Then they brought to him one who was deaf. So apparently somebody brought, a group brought him to Jesus for healing. He may not have been able to understand exactly what they were doing, but those who knew of Jesus and knew his condition were going to try to get Jesus and this deaf person together. Any other questions as we move on? We've got a few minutes remaining, and they haven't cut me off, so I just keep talking. Michael, it's not advancing for me. There we go. Thank you. And as we see here in chapter 8 of Mark, it says, in those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. We don't know if this was that kind of the continuation of that same gathering where he sat on the mountain and this multitude came to him, or if it was another one, but it still is a fact that Jesus had been there teaching them for 3 days, and they hadn't left to have anything to eat. And in verse 3, and if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from afar. Okay, so I knew we'd get to it, Jerry. Thank you. Some of them have come from afar. These were those who were traveling along. Jesus had a small contingent of his apostles and disciples who were traveling with him, and there were those that just kept following Jesus. And Jesus says, I've stopped here, and as they went along, you would imagine they would get some people who were from that area who would join in that multitude and come and listen to Jesus speak. And if I send them away to their houses, some of them may faint, may falter along the way. They may not make it back to their houses. The concern that often had been was the fact that there was this great multitude and they had little villages around there, and those villages didn't have enough bread at the local bakery to take care of that big number of people. And we're going to see that here again. But the disciples answering him when he said, I don't want to send them away hungry, they say, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? Jesus, we're out here on a mountain. There's no place close. How are we going to satisfy this group that they can be strengthened, that they can take food? How are we going to do that out here in the wilderness? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. I would imagine that the apostle couldn't carry enough food for all the people they were going to encounter along the way. But they had 7 loaves of bread. And in verse 6, so he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks and broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. Jesus broke the bread and told his disciples, set some before these people so they can eat. Go out and into that multitude. And, in one incident of this, they had told them to split up into groups of 50 and 100, and they fed them that way. Set it before them. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they had a few fish, they had some bread. Just take it as far, and we'll see how far it goes. We know how far it went. So they ate and were filled, and took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. They ate all they wanted. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. You need to go back to your homes, but I don't want to send you away hungry. Jody? I'm sorry? This was a different incident. Yeah. The apostle said, well, how are we going to do this, Jesus? And he said, don't you remember? We're going to see some of that a little later on in chapter 8. But yes, you know, they had the loaves and the fishes from this little boy's lunch, and there they fed a group that was headed by 5,000 men, and the presumption is that there were women and children there. Now here he fed 4,000 people is what it tells us, and still the apostles say, what are we going to do? We've got just a few loaves and a few little fish. What are we going to do? But Jesus took care of it there, and I think it's always kind of curious to me that Jesus wants to make sure they know that everybody had all they wanted to eat and then some, because they always pick up basketfuls of leftovers when they're done feeding all these large people. And Jerry's going to cut me off here, so I appreciate your attention and your discussion this morning. We will pick up here next week. Well, 2 weeks from now. I am traveling next week, but I'll be back that following week.